Hi everyone, Tom here at NovaCode. I originally uploaded this Express Node TypeScript server tutorial last night. However, I'm using some new recording software and unfortunately I was unfamiliar with the settings, so I ended up having streaming software settings instead of actual recording settings. And unfortunately, that produced a really hard to see monitor. So I'm hoping this time around you guys can see my monitor much better. We're going to cover the Express Node TypeScript tutorial all over again, and this time we're going to do it in high definition. So with that, let's go over the goals. We're going to create a REST API using Express, set up the server in TypeScript, add task automations for compiling using gulp, and pull in dependencies to start a persistence layer for our Mongo database. You're going to need npm, node, Mongo, and a good IDE. I'm going to use WebStorm for this tutorial, but you don't necessarily have to do that. However, if you're interested in using WebStorm to follow along with this tutorial, you can go over to jetbrains.com/webstorm/?from menu. They have a 30-day free trial that you can use. I highly recommend their products. They come fully integrated with all kinds of CLIs and neat little doodads to help you with Git and deployments to your server, and everything is really well supported. And if there's something that it doesn't have already built into it, odds are probably really good it's got a supported plugin somewhere. So I highly recommend this IDE. I'll be using the Pro version. However, I will let you hit this download button, get this IDE onto your PC, and see you in the next part of our tutorial. I'm assuming that you got your WebStorm in, or you at least have your favorite IDE open at this point, and I think that we should get moving with the tutorial. I'm going to put this guide over to the side pane here, and we're just going to follow along with this guide and make sure that we're staying honest. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to go to Create New Project, and this is going to be useful for people who are just starting out with WebStorm. If you already have WebStorm, just go to File, hover over New, and then click on Project, and you'll get prompted with this same New Project. For those of us who are using WebStorm, select Node.js Express app. For those of us who are not following along with this IDE, you will need to go and download the CLI for the Express generator. You can do that by going to Google and typing Express generator into the search bar, hit enter. In the first entry, Express Application Generator -JS will take you to where all the instructions are for getting the Express CLI. All you have to do is run this first command here, npm install express generator-g. Take a look through the remainder of this documentation. It will show you how to produce this file structure once you enter the creation commands for a new project, and it will get you caught up to where the rest of us will be with the WebStorm interface. So for those of us who are using WebStorm interface, go to the Node.js Express app, look up at the location bar and highlight this untitled and enter your application's name. So we're going to use TypeScript API. And underneath, you're going to need your node interpreter. So if you've never used WebStorm, all you have to do is go to the node interpreter, click on it, hit add, hit local. This will give you a browser to go find your node interpreter. Just head down the file path, point it to your node interpreter, should be good to go. In the version section, hit the recycle button. Make sure you're using the latest version of the Express generator. As of this recording, we're using 4.15.5. It doesn't matter which you leave the template and the CSS at. These are just default settings. We're going to delete all of this stuff anyways and put in our own custom files and folders. Hit create. It's going to open up a new IDE for you. It's going to begin building out your project, as you can see. Now we have a base file structure. So the first thing we're going to want to do is highlight public routes views in app.js. Hit your delete key and wipe these out. We're not even going to need them. So chuck them in the trash bin and we're going to keep on trucking. Head over to the project directory and right click on it. Go to new and add a directory to this. And let's scroll down a little bit in our guide, make sure that we have the right directory structure. And the first folder that we're going to want to add is called client. And then we're going to add another folder, and this is going to be called dist. We're going to add another folder that will be called server. And then inside of server, we're going to add another folder called src. And then we're going to take our bin folder at the very top here, and we're going to drag this into our server folder. So inside of server, you should now have a bin folder and an src folder. And inside of bin, you'll have a www file that was created as standard boilerplate code for us. And inside the src folder, we're going to need to create some new directories. So first one's going to be API. Then we're going to add interfaces. We will also add models. We're going to add schemas. And finally, we will add tests. At the server level, we're going to add a Typescript file. And this Typescript file is going to be titled server. So, just to open up all of our folders here, not the no modules one, we want to see the bin folder with a www file in it, the src folder with an API folder, an interfaces folder, a models folder, a schemas folder, and a tests folder. Inside of the server folder, we also want to see a server.ts file. In addition, we're going to add a tsconfig.json file to the server folder. Finally, for the last two files we're going to add these to the project level directory, and we're going to go to new JavaScript file, and we're going to call this gulp file. And we're going to add a TypeScript file called gulp file. And this should build out everything that we need. So I'm just going to leave the screen like this for a second. That way, if you need to pause to catch up to me with this file structure, you have an opportunity to do that. And I apologize for moving so fast, but this is a bit of a long video, and I want to try to get you through it. Moving on, there are three types of installs that we're going to do. We're going to do a global install, a dev dependency install, and then a just project dependency install. And these are going to be the libraries that we're going to be accessing within our project. And how you're going to do this is you're going to run these through npm commands in a terminal window. If you're using an IDE that does not support a terminal window, all you have to do is go down to Start, type cmd, and that will get you a cmd.exe where you can go ahead and jump into a terminal window. What you'll need to do at this point is navigate to your project directory and begin running your npm commands out of there. We will not be doing this because we use WebStorm and we're going to be a little elitist right now. So click on the terminal tab at the bottom of your WebStorm, and this is going to open up a terminal in your IDE. By the way, for you Mac users, if you are looking to open up a terminal window, you can hit Command-Shift and then type terminal into the search bar, and it will pull up your terminal for your Macintosh. I don't know why you use those things. I'm a little biased, but I will forgive you because you're watching my video. Anyways, I'm going to show you one of each type of the various dependencies we have, and then I'm going to pause this video for a little bit so I can run the rest of these dependencies and just rejoin you whenever we're finished. So the first one that we're going to do is called a global dependency, and we're going to install it by typing npm I gulp-cli space -g. The -g flag is a global flag. A global flag more or less says that you have access to this thing anywhere on your PC. What this really translates to is if I open a terminal window somewhere, I should be able to type up a gulp command and have that command run from a terminal window that I'm currently using. That's all the more a CLI is just a global scope command that I have that's global to my PC. The next kind of dependency we have is a dev dependency. So we can get to that by typing npm I Typescript space save dev. Now, a dev dependency is a special kind of dependency. It's a development dependency. It's something that only we developers care about. So if I was to go to my package.json file and look a little further down, I see this dev dependency object. This dev dependency object now has this TypeScript item in it that I just installed. What this means is that whenever I do a production build for my server, these dependencies will not be added to that production build. In other words, when I put this onto a live server somewhere, none of the things that fall underneath this object will be added to that server, because we don't care about them in production. We only care about them whenever we're doing development. The last dependency is just a straight up project dependency, and that's things like body parser, cookie parser, debug, express, Jade, but we're not going to be using Jade, so we can actually delete this. So I would just recommend deleting it now since we're on it. And Morgan, server favicon, and a few others. These kinds of dependencies get built when we run the prod flag on our project build. These will ultimately end up on production server and are necessary for the server to run correctly without errors. If we don't include these dependencies and we call a command that belongs to one of these libraries, this library won't exist and is basically accessing something that isn't there. That will kick you an error and probably crash your server, which is just bad juju. So let's make sure we install these. And you can install a regular dependency by simply typing npm I and then whatever your dependency might be. So error handler -- save. And notice we don't add the -dev flag in there. That now adds it to our dev dependency, as we see, located right here at line 12. I'm going to pause the video for a second and install the remainder of these dependencies, and I suggest that you go ahead and do the same. I will see you in a few moments. Okay, so we have all of our dependencies installed. I just got done checking through everything in the package.json to make sure it was all there. And you're probably wondering what some of these things do. Now, these packages are completely necessary for the way our project is going to be built. Let's go through all of these dependencies and talk about what each one of them does. Each one is going to be vital to our project, and we're going to use these all in various ways in order to help facilitate the things that we want to accomplish. The first one we're going to talk about is gulp. Gulp is a dev task runner. What is a task runner? Well, sometimes devs have to do things that are very repetitive in nature. So every time we build out our server, we're going to have to delete some files, take some TypeScript files, turn them into JavaScript, move them to a different directory. And we'll be doing this quite frequently because every time we make a change and we want to test that change to see whether or not our server is behaving correctly, we're going to have to do all of these little tasks over and over again. And this can get super, super annoying and time consuming as you're working on a particular story or feature that you're attempting to implement inside of your API. We don't want to do these things. Devs have better things to do with their time. So what we do is we run this little task runner that some dev somewhere created for us to help us get away from doing these menial tasks. And Gulp in particular is a basic structural program that allows the dev to add plugins to their project that facilitate Gulp for doing certain tasks. If any of this makes sense, don't worry. If it doesn't, it will make sense in a minute. These plugins that we use are things like Gulp source maps and Gulp TypeScript and run sequence. And even though Del is technically not a plugin, it's something that we're going to be making use of inside of our pipelines. So Gulp just provides the framework that these plugins attach to, and these plugins actually do the various tasks that we're attempting to achieve. We have gulp source maps, which creates an inline source map. Now, if you're not familiar with what a source map is, it's a pretty complex subject, and it's really not in scope for something to talk about here. But what we can say about a source map is a source map provides a way of mapping code within a compressed file back to the original position in a source file. That's a little bit complicated, but that's about the simplest one-sentence answer I can give you without going on a long tangential about what source maps are and how they work and why we need them. If you want to learn more about source maps, there's some really good resources out there. There is one at a website called Teen Treehouse. You can go find them at blog.teentreehouse.com. They have a very, very comprehensive walkthrough of what source maps are and how they work inside of JavaScript. All you need to know for this tutorial is that we have them and that they're really good and we need them. Next plugin we're using is gulp Typescript. This compiles our TypeScript files back into JavaScript. The next module we're going to be running is something called run sequence. Run sequence allows us to run a series of gulp tasks in a very specific order. So we're going to create a set of tasks where we're going to delete some files from one folder. We're going to copy some files from another folder into that folder, and we are going to transpile some TypeScript files into JavaScript and copy them into our dist folder as well. Each one of these tasks is an individual item, but we can set this up as a pipeline where we say delete, copy, transpile, put all that stuff into our dist folder. Yay, we have a happy server. The next thing that we have is TS Node, and this allows us to execute TypeScript in Node. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We also are going to be using del, and del is going to be how gulp deletes files from these various directories. And all we do is we just point del at a directory, and it just wipes out the files within it. Additionally, we'll be using Morgan for logging HTTP requests, body parser for parsing JSON and URL encoded data that's going to be passed to our server, and being able to access that on the body property of our request objects. We're going to have error handler, and this is a development-only error handler we'll be using for debugging. Mongoose, which is our persistence layer, and that's going to be facilitating our communications to the Mongo database in our next tutorial, and you should be seeing that before the end of this weekend, which would be around January 28th of 2018. We're going to be pulling in cores, and I'm going to revisit this in a second and explain this in a little more in depth. Finally, we pulled in all of these at types. And what are these at types? Well, we're using TypeScript on this server. And TypeScript is awesome because it's a strongly typed language. So I have access to the knowledge of what kinds of methods and what kinds of attributes and what kinds of return data types and what kinds of data types the attributes are. And I know many, many things about a given object that a library provides to me. These at types imports that we did provide the typing definition for each one of these libraries so that we have knowledge of what the objects are that we can work with and what they'll be returning and what they expect. Next up, I have CORS. So what does CORS stand for? CORS stands for cross-origin requests. This thing can create a lot of headache. And it's normally used when you have an API or an application that's split into two pieces, the front-end UI and then the back-end API. In the event that you want multiple apps to reach into a very universal API, or you have a split application in something, say, like Ionic, where you'll have your application housed on a cell phone and your backend housed on a server, maybe in the cloud, or on a server in your facility, these applications have to talk to that API somehow. Well, when they make a request for resources from that API, the request will be rejected because the request isn't coming from the originating server. And that's where the cross-origin request comes from, is that you have a server crossing over to another server to produce a request that does not arrive from its own origin. Does it make a little more sense now? So, in order to protect people from maliciously accessing APIs that they shouldn't be accessing, we have this cross-origin request in place to kind of create a barrier between who can request resources from our server and who can't. If CORS is not enabled, no outside application can speak to our API. Only an application that comes from our own server on the same port is allowed to talk to our API. Even if I have an application running on, say, port 4200 and a server running on port 3000, all on the same piece of hardware, I can't talk across those ports. That's going to create a problem for me. I can only talk to 3000 out of 3000. That's okay. That's coming off of the same origin. But if I have any other type of port that I'm attempting to communicate with, it will get rejected. So I install CORS in order to handle this. And what this does is it appends some special headers to the request saying that, yes, you're allowed to use this information. And in addition, it also sees incoming requests and says, yes, you're allowed to access it, assuming that they are either on a special list. You can create a list of applications that are allowed to access your API, so you don't necessarily have to expose it to the entirety of the world. You can say that this handful of applications are allowed to access my API and everybody else can pound salt. Or you can expose your API to the entire world. If you want your API to be public, you can use a star and say, let all cross-origin requests coming from all domains be allowed to access my API. You can also set a very finite list if you so choose and make it so that only your applications can access your API. Next, we are going to start adding some code. I know, finally, thank you. So head on over to the www file inside of the bin folder. Hit Control A and highlight all of this. Hit the delete button. Go over to www.novaco.com. Click on the Express Node Typescript blog and scroll down to find the code that we need, and go ahead and highlight that, copy it, and paste it into the IDE. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on in this file. The first line of code here is this server file, and we're going to require a file from a different directory called server. And what is this directory? Well, you got to remember this www file is going to get moved to this dist directory when we create a revision of this server. So we're going to go from the bin directory up to the dist directory, and we're going to look for a file named server in it, and we're going to store it in the server variable. The next line is something that we're going to need to change. So on your code, this is the part that I just highlighted should be called Express. Rename this to whatever your project name is, and make sure that it's all in lowercase. The code that you're using was taken from another project, and I don't want things to bleed over into your project, so make sure that you rename this this Express into whatever you have named your current project. However, this line of code is loading a debug library. The ninth line of code here is requiring the HTTP library. So what are we going to do with all this? Well, we're just basically going to create a server from it. So line 14 is where we're going to declare our port number. So if you have a special requirement to use a different port, like say port 3000, you can change it here at line 14, and you can type in 3000. However, for our purposes, 8080 is fine, and we can easily just use that. The next line is where we bootstrap our server. So what is bootstrapping? Well, bootstrapping comes from the term pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It really means that it tells the server to turn itself on, and in this case what we do is we call the server variable, and we ask for the server object, and we tell it to pull the bootstrap method in order to boot the server up. And finally we call app. Well, you'll see in the next file that by the time we get to app is going to be fully initiated and loaded up with all kinds of neat stuff, and it's more or less going to build out our entire server. The The last major line that we care about is this create server line where we pass in our port numbers. And this basically tells the server what port it needs to be listening on. So we set up our listener for that particular port number, and the very last line we're going to turn on the listener and say, all right, now we should be actively listening. This middle line here just sets up error handling, and the rest of this is general boilerplate that we really don't need to futz around with. So I really recommend leaving this code untouched and sort of just ignoring this for now. If you need to know a little more about it for possible configurations of a custom variety for your project, go ahead and Google some stuff and play around with it. But for this one, we shouldn't really touch this. This will meet all of our needs. Next, we're going to go to the server TS file, and we are going to copy and paste over some code. And first thing you're going to notice is that we're pulling in all of our dependencies, our body parser, our express, our Morgan, the path library, along with error handling, mongoose, and cores. But what I think that you will notice very quickly is that our path and cores aren't being used. And that's not to worry. We'll be using that in the next video. So just hang tight and you'll get to see how we're going to put those to use. Next, we're going to be calling a server class. If you remember, we just looked at this www file and we saw that server was calling the class server. Well, server has a static method on it called bootstrap. And if we take a quick look, we see that bootstrap returns an instance of the server. And the server has an attribute called app, which is of the type express application. So all we're saying here is return to me an instance of a server with the express application attribute. And what we're going to do is access that express application in our app variable. Well, what happens when we initiate a new server and instantiate a new class? We always call the constructor for that class. So we're going to hit this constructor method, and inside of this constructor method, this is where all of the magic happens. We're going to set the app attribute to the express method. And express is generally going to create the application for us. Now that app has been initialized, we can do some configuration to it along with setting up our API. Well, if we take a look at these methods, we see that the API is currently empty. And that's okay, because we're going to begin adding routes to this in the next video once we've hooked up our database. So for now, we're just going to leave this thing alone. In the config method, we have a couple of things going on. And basically, we're just loading up a bunch of middleware for our server. We're going to pull in Morgan for some logging purposes. The next thing we're going to do is pull in the body parsers. So if you remember right, the body parser parses JSON and URL encoded data into the body property of our request object. So all this stuff comes back as strings, and we need to convert it back into objects in order to be able to access it. So all we're doing here is we're loading this up onto our Express application so that when these requests come in as strings, we can convert them back into the objects that they need to be. The next thing that we're going to do on line 89 here is that we are going to launch our connection to our database, and we're going to do this through Mongoose. And we're making use of the Mongoose connect method. In the connect method, we just pass it a string and we tell it where our database resides. So in this case, we have it running on the local host off of port 27017. Now, this section right here, this Typescript Express, highlight this, delete it, and rename it to your project's name. So we're going to name ours Typescript API. I'm telling you to do this because we're going to name our database this. That way we don't have confusion inside of our Mongo database between our app and what our database is actually named. You may need to change this if you have more of a universal API that's not really tied to one app. For our purposes, this will be good enough. The next line handles all of the errors coming back, so if we hit something with our connection and it returns an error, we're just going to log it to the console. And finally, we have our 404 catch-all. So if we make a request to our API and the endpoint doesn't exist, we're just going to have the server return back a 404 error. Next, we're going to call the error handler method. And this is just going to kind of pick up any kinds of other errors that we may have on our server. Well, now that we've configured our TypeScript server, the next thing that we are going to need to do is go ahead and start setting up our gulp files. So let's head on down, scroll. And now that we have our gulp file information, let's head over to the gulp file.js, as in JavaScript. And we're going to paste this information into our JavaScript file. So what is this doing? Well, we're going to require the TypeScript node package. And what this does is it allows us to run TypeScript on a node environment. The next thing that we're going to do is pull in our gulp TypeScript file. And this is where we're going to set up all of our tasks. So let's head on over to the TypeScript file for the gulp files that we've created. And we're going to copy and paste some code in here. And these red requireds, it's highlighting it, and this actually really isn't an error. It's just that TypeScript doesn't know what these things are. So an easy way to get rid of this is npm I at types/node-save-dev. Sometimes it takes a little bit for it to go away once you've installed this. I wouldn't worry too much about it. It will find its way off. And it may mean that we also need to update our tsconfig file. So let me just go ahead and paste that in, and we'll revisit this afterwards. All right, that seems to have done it. We have been able to get rid of the red highlights on require now. And next thing we're going to do is take a look at these dependencies that we've pulled in real quick. We've already kind of talked about these, so I don't really feel like we need to cover them again. All you need to do is make note that we're pulling in gulp, del, run sequence, gulp source maps, and gulp TypeScript. Let's talk more about the actual tasks. So we're going to talk about these tasks real quick, and the first task is clean, and the first argument declares a namespace. All we're doing is we're just defining this so that we can call on it later by that name. Really, the magic happens right here. And all we're going to do is call on del to go to the dist folder and wipe out all of the files in the dist folder. This is that deletion process that I had talked about earlier. The next task that we're going to do is copy a bunch of files over. So we're going to go ahead and run gulp.src, which says go into this folder and grab me everything that's there. So we're going to go to bin and we're going to scoop up this dub file. And we are going to send that information to a function that's called gulp.dest. And gulp.dest is saying pass all the files that it receives from the bin directory to dist/bin. Well, there's no bin directory in dist, but that's okay because it'll create the directory on its own. Next up, we have this build express, and this one's a little more complicated than our other two tasks. What this one is ultimately going to do is it's going to create a bunch of source maps, take our TypeScript files, compile them back into JavaScript, and then it's going to write all of those JavaScript files to a folder inside the dist directory called server. I think you can pretty much follow this if you think about it really, really hard. But basically, the tsconfig has some information about how we're going to process these files. So we're going to pull this into our project variable. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to or use gulp.source again, and we're going to head to the server directory, go into the source folder, get every folder, which means API interfaces and the whole shebang, and get all of the TypeScript files that are associated underneath each one of these directories. Then we're going to turn them into JavaScript by using our tsconfig that we stored to the project variable, and we're going to pipe all of these JavaScript files into a source maps.write. So now we're going to create that mapping we had talked about earlier from the JavaScript files back into the TypeScript files. And the last thing we're going to do is write all of these JavaScript files to the dist folder into a directory called server. The very last task that we're going to declare is now going to create a pipeline for each one of these individual tasks to operate. So the first thing we're going to do is wipe out everything inside the dist folder. Then we're going to copy over the bin folder into the dist folder. Finally, we're going to vacuum up everything in the src folder and then convert it from TypeScript into JavaScript and paste it into the dist folder as JavaScript files. In a nutshell, that's basically everything that you need to know about this gulp file. So I copied some stuff over to the tsconfig earlier to fix our error that we were having on the highlighting with require. You can go ahead and put that code in now, but basically what this does is this is a lot of TypeScript configurations. And you can go to the TypeScript website if you really want to know more about them. However, I'm not going to cover that here because there are a ton of these flags, and that is pretty much a whole entire tutorial of its own. What you really need to know is that we're telling TypeScript what we want to be our target end file, which is JavaScript ES5. The other two items that you'll need to take note of is this type roots. And all we're doing is we're just telling TypeScript where it can find all of its type files. So you can see we just provided a pathway here back to the node modules folder, and if we look in it, we can find all of our types dependencies here. Finally, we have an exclude, which just says do not process anything in the node modules folder, which kind of makes sense because, hey, we can always do an npm I, and our package JSON records all this information and we'll install this stuff later. So there's really no need to process this folder. That pretty much sums up this lesson. Keep an eye out for our next video. We're going to talk about how to hook up to our Mongo database, how to read and write data to and from our database using Mongoose, and how to set up our data structures using object-oriented programming and why we use object-oriented programming on our back end. Additionally, we will be setting up another video shortly after that, and that video is going to show us how to set up our REST API and build our business logic in the back end so that we can communicate with our database the way that our business decides to. Thank you for watching our video, and please take the time to leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about the video, if there's anything that we can do to improve it. If there's any kinds of lessons that you would like us to cover, please feel free to leave that information as well. If you like what you've seen in this video, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any kinds of projects that you would like us to work on, please head on over to www.novacodellc.com. You can find it in the description below. Hit our Hire Us button and fill out the forms. We'll have a representative get back to you right away. And until next time, I will see you very soon.